At least 6 civilians have been killed in a fresh airstrike by the U.S.-led coalition in Syria. The airstrike targeted a village in the Syrian province of Hasaka. The victims include women. This comes as a British NGO says the U.S.-led coalition's air raids claimed the lives of more than 740 civilians in Syria and Iraq in June. According to Airwars, the coalition's recent attacks in the 2 Arab nations were often devastating. The monitoring group also says the June death toll is twice higher than the previous month. The revelations contradict the U.S. military figures that put the overall civilian toll in the U.S.-led operations at just over 600 since late 2014. To discuss that further, we're now joined by Mr. Tony Gosling, who is an investigative journalist, and he's joining us live now from Bristol via Skype. Mr. Gosling, thanks for joining us. What do you make of more civilian deaths at the hands of this U.S.-led coalition, which is meant to, of course, be fighting Daesh?
Well, look, the take-home from this latest revelation is double the number of civilian casualties in one single month. This organisation, Airwars, is doing a really important job as a NGO voluntary organisation, effectively with no official funding, not a commercial organisation. Well done, Airwars, because the coalition, the so-called coalition of the mostly US and British, have not released the figures. They will not release the figures of the estimated number of civilians that they kill month after month. They don't want us to know. In fact, they're not being honest with us, are they, about the way this war is being conducted? So they're looking at all of the various statistics to do with whether or not they're winning, etc. And they're only feeding the mainstream press, the BBC, ITV, Channel 4, etc. here in Britain, CNN in America, with the figures that they want the public to know about. The other figures, they're not letting them know. And you know what? The journalists don't even ask those questions. Okay, how many civilians were killed this month? There's very little, if any, proper interrogation of the military and of the politicians behind the military making these decisions, or, of course, the arms firms making the money from these wars about the civilian fallout. But look, one of the reasons for this is because many of the fighters, many of whom are mercenaries, are being moved from Iraq into Syria. Just as when Gaddafi was killed in Libya, we saw the civil war, as some call it, others would call it the regime change attempt in Syria, start at exactly the same time. So as soon as Gaddafi was toppled, the Western powers and Israel and Saudi Arabia moved all of the fighters, the mercenaries, over to start the civil war in Syria. And it's not just me saying that, it's Roland Dumas, the former French foreign minister on LCP TV, back in 2013, said that he had been in London in 2009 and he was approached, and I would presume this was some kind of Foreign Office event, but he doesn't make that clear, because they wanted to start an uprising in Syria. This is 2009, remember, and who was the Foreign Secretary at the time? Supposedly overseeing this? Well, it was David Miliband, the brother of the Labour leader Ed Miliband at the time. And Miliband was also found guilty of actually secretly sanctioning torture and also secret prisons, as well as helping start the uprising in Syria, in fact arming some of the rebels and bringing more mercenaries over from Libya. So this is our, I'm afraid, British involvement in what's happened in Syria. Also, of course, the carnage. This is just more of a bloodbath going on, hopefully over soon, but who knows, in Iraq. And Bush and Blair, of course, were tried. Very few people know that, over in absentia in Malaysia in November 2011, and found guilty of war crimes. So there is a complete failure in the West to acknowledge that we have become the evil empire, and that the war criminals at the top of our society, including people like David Miliband, others behind the scenes, putting British soldiers in to help the Saudi bombing of Yemen, for example, are war criminals, and they're walking the streets still, which is an appalling thing to be British in these days, or American, and see these war crimes going unpunished.
Mr. Gosling, you know, it's interesting, isn't it, that since the liberation of Mosul from the hands of Daesh, it's the United States which has been making the most noise about having carried out that liberation, when we all know that it's Iraqi forces who led that operation. It's Iraqi forces that have been killed at the highest rate in trying to free that city. Why is it that the U.S. is trying to take credit wherever there is, for example, a win against Daesh?
Well, you make an excellent point. And one does wonder whether some of the military planners have been studying medieval techniques here, because as many people point to the Israelis as a crusader state, the tactics in those days are just the same now. Divide and rule. They would much rather Iraqis get killed fighting ISIS or Daesh than American soldiers. And they actually smirk, I think, behind their hands like this. You know, they're smirking as they see one poor person kill another poor person, especially if they're foreign, and especially if their friends in the arms industry are making money at it. I'm afraid we've got to do something about that here in the West. We are not quite getting to grips with it, but more and more people, I think, are aware. I think at the end of the day, though, the real criminals in all of this, it might sound strange to say it, are the press. The media who lied in the run-up to the Iraq war about weapons of mass destruction, they're still lying today. What they are is the spearhead for the war criminals. They sow the seeds of dislike and distrust that the military and the mercenaries then come along and then take over territory. They're taking over territory illegally, of course. They're also trying to take over resources. But what they're also doing is they're balkanizing the Middle East, turning it into a basket case. That's what they're trying to do. And that really only benefits one country. That's Israel. That's why I think also the Israeli lobby in London, the Israeli lobby in Washington has played a major part in making these wars happen. And I'm afraid many of our MPs and many of our Congress women and men have actually become complicit in this lie. They get briefed by the security services here in Britain, and they don't listen to independent journalists, people like Vanessa Beeley, etc., who've been over there, former ambassadors like Craig Murray, like John Ford from Syria, who are telling as many people as they can in Britain the truth about what's happening in Syria. But the fact is the mainstream media, the BBC, ITV, Channel 4, etc. here in Britain are effectively the gatekeepers. They keep the truth away from the members of the public, but not only that, also the politicians and the decision makers. And they are a major reason why we've got this carnage still in the Middle East today.
Okay, Mr. Gosling, we'll leave there at that. But of course, as always, we appreciate you taking your time out to speak to us.